Thank you, Madam Postmaster. This morning I changed the title of my speech and I put an introduction in to Easy Speak, but I understand you've probably been quite busy this morning and haven't seen that yet. At any rate, when you're in more than one path and pathways, you get a little bit redundant at the beginning because first speech is an icebreaker. Fortunately, in pathways, the way the icebreaker is assigned, Mickey, I'm sorry, but I'm going to get you out of the way here. The way that the icebreaker is assigned is you can talk about anything you want. So 2 icebreakers ago, I talked about my history growing up in Massachusetts and Maryland, going to Penn State for 6 years and joining the Navy and seeing the world. And then an icebreaker after that, I talked about my Toastmasters introduction. And today I thought, well, with the election out of the way, maybe I can dare to be a little bit political. And so the title of my speech is How I Became a Conservative. Now, I know that Arnie in particular and Fred really wanted to be interested in this, and maybe they'll treat me more kindly in political discussions after the speech. Well, it started back actually when I was in middle school, living in Maryland, and the first political or historical thing that I remember which impacted me was in 1956 when Hungary tried to start a revolution and become a free country. And the Soviet Union was having none of that. And they sent in the tanks and Lord knows what else and put it down. And that really upset me. And to this day, it stays in my head as what started me off on my political persuasion today. Well, a couple of years later, I was introduced to a book by then Senator Barry Goldwater. It was called The Conscience of a Conservative. And this is the book right here. And it's very small, it's easy to read, and there's a lot of wisdom in here. And I read this whole thing, and I said, this makes perfect sense to me. I think I'm going to be a conservative. I like this guy Goldwater. And so in 1960, I was finishing high school and on to college at Penn State. The next thing I remember as I was about my political development was I was sitting in a room with someone had come in to speak. And I can't remember if it was the individual I'm about to mention or somebody else, but I went to the session to listen to what they had to say. And I had this political sign. Of course, Kennedy was running for president at that time. And the Soviet Union was run by a guy by the name of Khrushchev. And my sign said, "One Mr. K is enough." Suddenly behind me, I heard this whirling voice, "Oh, one Mr. K is enough. That's great." And this big guy comes over and he says, "I'm Senator Scott." This is a good one. That was Senator Hugh Scott of Pennsylvania at the time. And I still remember that incident. Now, we were pushing for Goldwater actually in the fall of 1960, but it didn't go very far, obviously. And in fact, he pulled out himself. And the way we were supposed to campaign the rest of the term was to say, Goldwater says, don't dodge, vote Nixon and Lodge. Lodge, Henry Cabot Lodge, who was the vice presidential candidate at the time. Now, Nixon did not win that time around, and so Kennedy became president. And during that time, the upswell, the groundswell for Goldwater increased dramatically at Penn State and actually around the country. And so we were really pushing for him to be nominated the next time around because many people felt at that time that Kennedy was beatable, that Goldwater could beat Kennedy in an election. And unfortunately, that was interrupted on November 22nd, 1963, 59 years ago, almost to the date, when Kennedy was assassinated. And after grieving initially, my first thought was, oh, there goes the 64 election. And so that's really ultimately what happened. Goldwater did get nominated, of course, in 1964. I still quote some of his acceptance speech from time to time, but that's a different speech. And I don't want to get Arnie too upset or Fred, so I won't bring that particular one up, except simply say that during the Goldwater campaign, we knew he didn't have any chance against Lyndon Johnson. At that particular point, God couldn't have beaten Lyndon Johnson. Johnson was going to win no matter what, and he did. But I know my roommate and I, who was a fellow conservative, we both said, if we win this election, we're going to be very poor winners. But we never got the chance to be a poor winner, at least not in that time. At that same time, Ronald Reagan came into the forefront. He gave a speech in support of the Goldwater campaign, which was basically a speech about conservative principles. And it kind of catapulted him into the political sphere. He really was there already because he'd just been elected governor of California. And of course, in 1980, he was nominated and ran for president and won by a significant amount. And then 4 years later, he won by a landslide. There was only one state that didn't vote for Reagan in 1984. That state was Minnesota. So, at any rate, by this time, I'm well entrenched in the conservative principles, and they said, we finally won. We finally got there. You know, we got one of our guys is president. Whew. So I was still in the Navy then, and when you work for the government, you can't go out and campaign and take sides. You know, on the record, you have to do what you better do in the background. So I did, and then Reagan came along. We talked about the evil empire and started the so-called Star Wars program. And in time, we had the collapse of the Soviet Union. To me, that was the highlight of my political life. I mean, I didn't do anything to make it happen except for voting for Reagan, perhaps. But this to me was the culmination of believing as a conservative as I did. Well, today we've gone through several other presidents and we've gone off in different directions. And today, after the election, I think last week, we have a semblance of checks and balances. Yeah, where the Republicans have taken over the House and can act as a balance against anything that the Senate tries to do or the president and the administration tries to do. So that's how I got to where I am today. And so Arnie and Fred, I think now you can understand why I feel the way I do, or I hope so. And I feel that because of my conservatism, I'm living an enchanted life.